Part 3. Wind becomes water. "Do they hurt?" the girl asked, as she ran her fingers across the boy's chest. "Not anymore. My shoulder aches sometimes, and it hurts if I raise my arm too high over my head. But that just means if I want to wave at someone, I use my other hand." The girl laughed, and it sounded good. She pulled her hand back and said, "My mother says I should stay away from you. She says you are cursed, that a spirit man from another tribe cursed you." "I do not feel cursed. Bad things happen all the time. Who can say why?" The boy looked at her closely. "So, how come you are not listening to your mother?" The girl wrinkled her eyebrows until they almost touched. "Do you do what people tell you to do, or what you want to do?" The boy had never met anyone like her. She would say whatever she wanted like a crazy person. She would say some things you couldn't think of an answer to if you had a whole handful of days. "Both, I guess." He let himself feel clever for a moment. Then he realized she had given him a compliment by saying that she wanted to be with him, and he felt stupid for using his energy to think up an answer to her words instead of just accepting them. She looked at him with eyes full of knowledge. "Well, which do you want to do now? What you want, or what someone else wants?" The boy shook his head. Who knew girls could be so challenging? Certainly not him. This was the first time he had ever talked to a girl alone. He was not well liked by anyone, let alone girls his own age. When Brightwater had begun to smile and trade a word or two with him in camp, he was surprised. When she whispered in his ear to meet her by the little grove of white-flowered trees outside of camp, he was left standing open-mouthed. But he had come. "Well, since we are the only ones here," he began cautiously, "if I did what someone else wants, that someone would be you." The girl's eyes quickened. Maybe there was hope for him yet. What if we both wanted the same thing? Walksenblood's eyes got big as robin's eggs. Brightwater just laughed and pushed him in the shoulder. He started smiling, and soon the little grove was filled with laughter. White Hand sat in his grotto, spitting up vileness. He leaned back against a bank of dirt that was softened by animal hides. He insisted on sitting up so he could see outside. He refused to die staring at the roof of a cave. One of the women came in to give him fresh water, and he eyed her suspiciously. She set the clay pitcher down beside him without making eye contact, and then left without saying a word. Good, White Hand thought. She is still afraid. Maybe the others are afraid as well. Maybe they think I am exaggerating my illness to test their loyalty. He did not trust any of his people any more than they trusted him, and one of the captive women would be just as likely to speed his departure from life as one of his men. He tightened his namesake around the long knife he kept hidden beneath the thin hide that covered him. He could not keep warm and only moved to relieve himself in the corner of his cave. He forced himself to eat, but the food clung to the roof of his mouth and refused to go down smoothly. He could not breathe well and constantly spit foul-tasting projectiles at the stone walls. But the worst thing was the dreams. White Hand had awful night visions where he saw people he had forgotten about long ago. He saw them as clearly as he had just seen that woman bring the water. Oftentimes the bad feelings he felt in the dream stayed with him long after he woke, and those feelings left a far worse taste in his mouth than the things he coughed up. It was his younger brother who suggested that he might have been cursed by a witch woman or a spirit man. He would sit beside White Hand as he slept, and must have seen how the dreams tortured him. He had said that only an evil spirit could cause such dreams, and an evil one might also be the cause of his illness. Out of politeness, White Hand would not burden his brother by telling him the dreams, but he must have known of their powers just the same. The fact that his brother would often sit with him while he slept was a comfort White Hand appreciated greatly. As well as seeing a friendly face when he woke in terror, he knew his brother would protect him from any of the men who might have a grudge against him. White Hand used to pride himself on being a light sleeper, and would claim that he could feel when someone was near, that he wouldn't need to hear them to wake up. But now that he was sick, what did it matter if he couldn't be caught unaware? If someone found the nerve to try him, they would also find out just how weak he was. Still, with his brother gone, he fought sleep like he fought to stay alive. White Hand had dreamt of the old chief, Red Knife. That was a man, a warrior chief worthy of his loyalty. In the days of Red Knife, the people were strong and their enemies feared them. Red Knife did not wait for the enemy to grow strong and confident enough to attack. He took the fight to them, driving them away and scattering them to the four winds. Red Knife had died in battle, a proper end for such a one. But what would his own end be? A miserable wasting death in a cave? Or maybe to have one of these dogs that called themselves men kill him in his weakness? White Hand thought maybe it would be better for him to die in a fight before he got too weak to move. He saw a gopher boy pass by the grotto, and actually felt his legs tighten as if to rise on their own. He hated that bitch boy, hated the way he lisped his words and looked at a person when he thought them unaware, as if scanning for weaknesses. That bitch boy would be the one to cut a man's throat while he slept. He was a sneaking cur, not worthy of the breath he took. White Hand stopped himself with an effort. He had grown old and knew himself well. He knew he had to stop the flow of his thoughts before they ran with blood. If he didn't make his mind still, Gopher Boy or he himself would bleed out before the day was over. Maybe later he would give one of his men a chance to kill him, but he wanted to give his brother a chance to return first. He would calm himself, at least for the time being. Scorpion Foot, coming out of nowhere, appearing from nothing, walks up. He is covered in blood, and his eyes are dark and fearful. He speaks. "So, Crooked Eye, you told Red Knife my secret, didn't you?" Crooked Eye trembles in body and speech. No. He asked, but I never told him I knew because you asked me to follow Elkhorn. I never said that I showed you where they would be." Scorpionfoot laughs in soulless tones. "Of course you did not say that you showed me where I should kill Elkhorn. I did not pick you because you were a fool. But answer me this. How did Red Knife know where to find Elkhorn if you did not tell him our secret?" Crooked Eye starts blubbering and shaking with emotion. "I just showed him. I didn't say anything. I just showed him where." Scorpionfoot's eyes turn to slits. "You lie. Red Knife must have asked you how you knew. You had to tell him something." "I told him that the spirits told me where," Crooked Eye says, full of shame. "The spirits told you? The spirits told you? So now you're a shaman, huh? So now you can talk to spirits, huh? Do you even know what it means, boy, to see what I see?" Scorpionfoot places his bloody hands on Crooked Eye's shoulders. They feel like two blocks of ice. The cold flows into Crooked Eye's head and eyes. "Do you want to talk to a spirit?" Scorpion Foot says. "Then say a few words to this one." Crooked Eye sees Elkhorn as he saw him that day with Red Knife on the grassy finger. But he is walking toward them from behind Scorpion Foot. Elkhorn's head waves back and forth, and Crooked Eye sees the man's neck bone. His eyes follow the blood trail that leads downward toward the dead man's groin. Crooked Eye sees nothing where the horrible specter's manhood should be. "The animals took it. The animals took it. They took it. Oh no, they took it from him." Crooked Eye yells in sadness and horror. The man suddenly woke up, bolting into a sitting position. The fear faded quickly. When he first started having the dream, the fear clung to him like briars. Oftentimes he would make himself stay awake out of fear of falling back into the dream. But time had passed, and Scorpion Foot wasn't coming back. Those two facts took the teeth out of the dream, though it still had bite enough while he was dreaming it. No, Scorpion Foot wasn't coming back. Of that the man was sure. But he still had trouble going back to sleep. He had done it. He had done the thing that he had heard talked about more than anything else. All the men and boys spoke of it, laughing and telling stories. Now he could joke and tell tales with them. Well, maybe a word or two anyway. It was over before he knew it. But what did that matter? He had done it just the same. Walks and Blood swaggered along, feeling like a conqueror, and thinking about what had just happened. One moment he and Brightwater were rolling on the ground laughing, and then she began touching his chest as she had done earlier, and the thrill went through him as it had before. Only this time she didn't stop touching him, and the thrill went to his tender parts and woke them up. Once made aware of the situation, his member would not lay back down. When Brightwater had seen him poking upward, she looked at him and smiled. "Has anyone taught you what that thing is for yet?" "No," he had said, stumped in finding anything else to say. "Well, maybe it is about time someone did," she had said. "Show it to me." Walks and Blood had reached down and lifted up the flap of his garment. He did not look at himself. The sight of him pointing at the sky was all too familiar. Instead, he looked at her, filled with delight, watching her as she studied and touched him. After Brightwater had appraised him for a few moments with a discerning eye, her breathing became shivery. Then, without ceremony, she had pulled up her dress, climbed on top of him, and had taken him inside herself. In a few moments he felt himself ache with pleasure, and then Brightwater had laid on top of him. He had held her for a while, before she told him that he should go back to camp alone. True, it was over before it started, as brief as a flash of light through the trees, and yes, he hadn't really done anything, but he was there. And now, as he walked home, he knew it to be the second most important thing that had ever happened to him. He suddenly felt like running, so he did. After all, he was still just a boy. You had the dream again. Crooked Eye looked at Snowbird. She made her statement in such a flat tone. What did she mean, the dream? And how could she know such a thing? But mornings were a hard enough time without argument. "I did have a troubling dream. How did you know? Did I cry out?" "You thrashed around like a shore-bound fish. Lately I think you do more before morning comes than after. What did you dream?" Never you mind. Sometimes a dream is just a dream and nothing more. That is a strange thing for a shaman to say, Snowbird shot back. Crooked Eye knew many men who beat their women like they were captives. Sometimes he understood why they might want to raise their hand, but he himself never had and never would. It just wasn't in him, and sometimes Crooked Eye felt Snowbird knew it and took liberties because of it. It made him angry. Why must you start the day by chiding me, woman? Life is not difficult enough. Do other men tolerate their wives as I tolerate you? I doubt it. Snowbird looked at him, a little surprised at his irritability. I am sorry. I guess your dreams are yours alone. Crooked Eye studied her carefully and smiled inwardly. He never hoped to get such a woman. He was proud of her. When other men looked at her with coveting eyes, instead of jealousy, Crooked Eye felt pride. The boy that grew up being laughed at and mocked was now lying beside a woman the mockers lusted after. Life could be worse. I need to take a walk, he said, a polite way of saying he needed to take care of his morning business. He ducked out of the lodge and stretched. He waved at his two sons, who were running around camp playing tag. They always got up before he and Snowbird did. He headed for the wash that lay to the west of camp. Crooked Eye liked to sit in the swirling water on mornings that were warm enough, and that day was unusually warm for springtime. He had just stood up after tucking the rear flap of his garment in against his waist and relieving himself, when they came for him. He never heard a thing, and they were on him so quickly he never stood a chance. Crooked Eye hit his face hard against the ground when they tackled him, so hard, in fact, that a pebble was embedded painfully in his right cheek and he was knocked out of his proper senses. Up became down, and the ground swirled while the wash stood still, as he felt the thongs being wrapped on his hands and feet with expert speed and skill. Two men carried him bodily while a third lagged behind, watching to make sure the abduction had not been observed. Crooked Eye shook with fear. He was a target, a prize to his people's enemies, and he knew it. He was considered by rival tribes to be the most dangerous threat to them. He was the medicine man, the weaver of dreams and the caster of spells, the spirit bringer and the singer of death's chants. He was the only one who could harm them from afar. To capture, torture, and kill him would be a great victory to the enemies of his tribe. After convincing himself that they had not been seen, the third member of the kidnappers caught up to his fellows. He shook his head, and the other two threw Crooked Eye to the ground. The poor man lay there on his side, quivering in terror, his face bleeding and his limbs bound. One of the men grabbed the thong between his feet and pulled it loose. In doing so, he flipped Crooked Eye onto his back, forcing him to see two of his attackers. It was Sharp Elbow and Three Bears. Crooked Eye, though still in a bad way, felt a little hope. Being captured by renegades out of your own tribe was better than being taken by the Crow or the Shoshone. With them, all he could hope for was a speedy death. Sharp Elbow was known to be an especially bad man, and Three Bears had been cast out for refusing to obey tribal law, but they might not kill him. He was just beginning to speculate on why they had taken him when Sharp Elbow pulled him to his feet. Then the tall outlaw pulled a piece of garment from his leggings, circled behind Crooked Eye, and tied it around his face. The smelly piece of leather had a hole for his nose and acted as both a blindfold and a gag. Sharp Elbow had insisted they gag the shaman to keep him from using the power of his mouth against them. "He might curse us with an illness or bring an evil one to take our strength from us," he had said. Three Bears had laughed, but cut that laugh short when he saw the look in Sharp Elbow's eye. Sharp Elbow was known to exact revenge in alarming ways. It was said that once he caught scorpions and cut off their stingers. Then he sat beside his unsuspecting victim, waited for him to rise from his place before the fire, and put the stingers down so the man would sit on them when he came back. A man who could think of such a thing was not to be laughed at. The third man had stayed behind Crooked Eye before the gagging, so he could not see him. But who else could it be but another outlaw? A length of rope was tied to the cord that held his hands, and Crooked Eye was led away on his leash. He could see a little through his nose hole, which allowed him to walk without stumbling. The four men moved steadily away from the wash. Crooked Eye guessed them to be moving north, but he really didn't know. The trees around him blocked the sun, and without it he had never been able to tell direction. He had realized that he had no wood sense at an early age. It was just clear that he lacked something that the other boys had. When they left camp to shoot at birds with their blunted arrows, a young Crooked Eye had lived in terror of being separated from his companions. He knew that if he was, he might never find his way home, so he had always made sure to stick close. The others never found out his incompetence in that area, but when his group would find something to shoot at, it was impossible to hide his ineptness as a marksman. It was lucky for him he had found a better way to keep himself fed. He often thought he would have had a better chance throwing the arrow than launching it from his bow. He felt a grim humor at the thought of being blindfolded. 2 of his captors had actually traveled with him in the wood as a boy, but apparently neither one had ever realized his shortcomings. Then he felt a little more hope. Since he was blindfolded, maybe they wouldn't kill him. Why bother hiding the eyes of a dead man? He stumbled for a moment and felt the cord on his wrist tighten. He pointed his nose in the air, and looking alongside it, saw that 3 bears held the tether. The stocky man jerked it impatiently, and Crooked Eye felt the tightness on his wrist grow and the veins in his hands swell. The smell of death suddenly filled the air, and the little party of men stopped. Crooked Eye quickly pulled at his bonds with his little fingers and was able to loosen them slightly. The other men did not speak, but the shaman felt their tension. They took a loop to the right, obviously avoiding the source of the smell. The spirit of the dead one might still be around. Perhaps they think I will call for it to attack them for me. Crooked Eye thought. That would explain why my mouth is tied, but the cord on my hands is just plain foolishness. They already took my knife, and as for running or fighting, they are 3 and I am 1. Maybe the cord is there for the sake of tradition. The ground sloped downward and became sparse in the way of greenery. They had now been traveling for some time, and their prisoner was tired. Crooked Eye sighed in relief when they finally reached the bottom of the slope and stopped. Sharp Elbow removed the leather mask from his face, and Crooked Eye saw the home of the bad ones. Sharp Elbow pulled his knife, and Crooked Eye couldn't keep himself from shivering. The tall renegade looked at him with a knowing disgust before saying, "The moment you say or do something I do not like or understand, which or not, your blood will cover this knife." Then he unwrapped the cord that held Crooked Eye's hands and tucked it back into his leggings. The shaman avoided the man's eye the way he would avoid the eye of a mountain cat. He had finally seen his third attacker, but didn't recognize him. He thought him to be the member of another tribe. Well, not a member anymore. He was probably a renegade Cree. It was not unusual for outlaws of enemy tribes to band together to form a tribe of their own, a tribe of bad ones. "Come on." 3 Bears gave him a shove in the back. Crooked Eye thought that Sharp Elbow feared him a little, but 3 Bears just seemed to hate him. The squat man had pulled on his tether during their journey like he wanted him to fall. His hands had turned colors from the tension put on them. He inhaled sharply as he pulled the stone from his cheek, and he felt fresh blood flow down his face as he walked through the canyon. It was probably Three Bears who had tackled him by the wash. They were in a small canyon that was bordered on three sides by steep cliffs. The rocky slope they had just gone down was the only way in. The place was well chosen. 2 lookouts were all that would be needed, and once they saw intruders, all fighting would be face to face. Three Bears and Sharp Elbow ushered him toward a wide-mouthed cave. When they drew close, Crooked Eye saw a man reclined toward the back of it. He cautiously followed his 2 guards into the cliff's mouth. At first, the only thing he recognized about the old but not old one on the hides was how thin and grim he looked. But then the man shot a look in his direction and pulled a knife from beneath his blanket, and Crooked Eye remembered him. The medicine man stared at the pale hand and the thin, jagged knife it held for a moment before realizing that White Hand was looking behind him. He turned and saw a sleek young man walking away from the cave with a strange, bouncy gait. Crooked Eye turned back around and looked at White Hand. About the only thing he could remember about the man besides his hand was that it was a good idea to stay away from him. White Hand used to cover the part of his hand that the color had departed from with mud or dirt. Many thought it an act of vanity, but Crooked Eye knew he did it to keep the sun from burning him. Now that hand was luminescent in the dim light of the cave. White Hand had struck out on his own with his brother Sharp Elbow and a few others long ago. Crooked Eye had counted only a few men in the canyon besides his abductors. But that didn't mean there weren't other outlaws around. Occasionally the tribal council would put someone out for robbing or killing, and over the time since White Hand and his men had left, some men had turned up missing. Maybe they had slipped off to join the outlaws, or maybe they came upon their stronghold by mistake and were made a permanent part of the canyon floor. "You are the one called Crooked Eye, the shaman," White Hand said. "The last I saw you, you were little more than a boy. I dreamt of Red Knife 2 nights ago. Red Knife held you up as a spirit man after Scorpion Foot left." The leader of the renegades paused to take his strangled breath. As he did, he noticed a change in the shaman. The already tense man had become stiff as a tree. White Hand pondered what it might mean for a few moments, but gave up, realizing that maybe all he had was a few moments. He couldn't afford to waste time trying to read a shaman with an undisciplined eye. "Red Knife said that you told him where the body of Elkhorn would be after Scorpion Foot cut his throat. He said you were in camp, and the only way you could have known such a thing was if some of the spirit of Scorpion Foot had leapt into you." White Hand stopped again and noticed that the shaman had quit breathing. Was he sending a spirit to bring help? "Speak, shaman. Tell us if you have the power that was Scorpion Foot's." Crooked Eye knew he didn't have the luxury of time to think, so he trusted the only power he had ever known. He opened his mouth and let the words fall out. "I do not have the power of Scorpion Foot. His was the power of blood and strength. Mine is the power of understanding. I do not control and wield the spirits as Scorpion Foot could. My power lies in seeing the root of a problem and pointing the way toward a solution." Crooked Eye watched the 3 men digest his words and hoped he did not corner himself with them. These were men of blood. They would kill him the moment they thought he was no longer useful. Crooked Eye didn't know about the 2 brothers, but Three Bears would not hesitate in killing a shaman any more than he would hesitate in slaying a deer. Crooked Eye's mind roiled with thought. He was glad he didn't let tension freeze his mouth. He knew he had to speak quickly and convincingly, that people trusted the voice of a man more than the words it carried. His mind rolled on, searching for something about White Hand he could use as Three Bears spoke. If you cannot control the spirits, what good are you? How can you chase away the spirit that is consuming White Hand? The blocky man's voice told Crooked Eye that it didn't believe the words it carried. Three Bears was a hard man, an unbelieving one, and since Crooked Eye did remember something about him, he used it. Three Bears, my eye has shown me the day that you claimed the elk as your kill, ate the choice parts, and gave the rest to Wood Duck. The spirits have shown me this not to accuse you, but to assure you that I can help White Hand. Three Bear's eyes widened, and he turned his head away from Crooked Eye involuntarily. How could he know? He and Wood Duck had both shot at the elk many summers ago. Wood Duck could not travel swiftly because of stiffness in his ankles, but the man could certainly draw a bow. Three Bears had gone ahead following the blood trail and left Wood Duck behind. When he had found the elk, he saw that it was a prize bull, and he wanted it. He grabbed Wood Duck's arrow where it stuck out between the fallen animal's ribs. He pulled the arrow out as far as he could before breaking off the head. Fitting the broken arrow to his bow, he quickly shot it high and far away from the elk it had killed. Then he shot his own arrow into the same hole with half a draw. He knew that when Wood Duck finally caught up to him, he would never know the difference. And yet, many summers later, this one-eyed shaman did. I need to make water, Three Bears said, and left the cave. White Hand smiled a small smile, and Crooked Eye saw that he had made an impression on him as well. White Hand knew Three Bears well, and could probably tell that the man was shaken. Crooked Eye remembered more of the day that Wood Duck had come to him. He was a new shaman then, just gaining acceptance, and the stiff-jointed man called upon him and asked him if he could see if Three Bears had stolen an elk from him. Crooked Eye knew that if he told Wood Duck yes, he might gain Three Bears as an enemy, but he also saw that Wood Duck believed he was the one that hit the elk. The elk was partly hidden by trees or brush, Crooked Eye had said. Wood Duck, a simple man, answered, yes, it was. How did you know? Would there be a dispute if it was shot in the open? The young shaman had thought. But what he had said was, I have seen it with my eye. Then he turned his left eye toward Wood Duck and opened it wide. And with my eye the spirits have shown me that it was Three Bears who hit the elk, though you are a better shot. And so Wood Duck had left, thankful to have his mind eased, while Three Bears was not angered by an accusation. And Crooked Eye was paid in elk meat later that night, though Wood Duck's confidence had paid off more handsomely just now. Three Bears would have other things to think about now, besides turning the others against him. White Hand stuck his blade firmly in the cave's floor and then waved at the ground next to him. Sit, shaman, and we will talk. You seem to have skill in this area. I do? Don't play games with me, Walks in Blood, not unless you want to become Walks by himself again. Brightwater made an up and down gesture with her hand. If memory serves, there were 3 times where you should have gotten a hint as to how well you were doing. Walks in Blood knew at times like this it was better to just let her talk and not try to understand her words. She liked to argue, probably because she always won, and seemed to be able to find discord where there was none. He looked at her as she lay naked beside him on the cool grass. White petals were stuck here and there on her brown body. He took one of them off the side of her breast and put it on her nose. Her expression softened into a demure smile. As she rolled on her side and put her hand on his chest, the dogwood petal fell off. In fact, you seem to be so good, I think maybe I do not need anyone else. He looked at her in astonishment. He knew that she laid with other boys. About half the boys his age claimed to have been with Brightwater. He had also seen her exchange glances with many others, so he figured at least half those claims were true. He felt himself swell up inside with pride. What a thing it was. She wanted him. What about you? Do you think you need anybody else? Brightwater asked. In the false calm, Waxen Blood knew to be like a thin layer of ice on deep water. You know there has not been anybody else, so how can I answer that question? How can you answer that question? You can answer that question by how you feel in here. She poked him in the chest with a fingernail. I know how I feel, so why can't you know? Why is that a hard question? Sometimes I wonder why I'm with you at all. Sometimes I think Waxen Blood thought that now would be a good time to use the lesson of the bear. He thought it strange that such a temperamental and unpredictable beast could teach patience, but he was glad it could. The lesson was why Brightwater wanted him and nobody else. I wonder what my mother would say if He had learned to watch himself in his coupling with her from the place with no time, and from there he could see himself giving pleasure to Brightwater. From that place, their love play for him was still just a moment, but for Brightwater it was a long time. She would look at him afterward in tired astonishment, and he could feel her emptiness. Oftentimes he let himself be sucked into the emptiness behind her eyes. Those times were good. Our children would look like us, I guess. How come you never say anything? That will be hard to get used to. But I suppose I will manage. I can always talk to the other old women. Or maybe one of our children will like to. True, he didn't really understand her, but what was there to understand? They liked each other and felt good together. His mother was dead, and his father did not care about him, so he was his own man, more or less. And the mother Brightwater was always worrying about would certainly get used to the idea of their being together. She never talked about her father much, so maybe Raven's Beak didn't care what she did. Maybe all he would have to do is give Raven's Beak a few horses, and the matter would work itself out. He knew Brightwater was argumentative and headstrong, but that really didn't bother him. He knew she wasn't as good to look at as some of the other girls, but those other girls didn't want him. She did, and somehow that made her better to look at. She was lively, and he was sure she would be a hard worker and good with their children. He was also sure she was crazy. Maybe this will wake both of you up. Waxen Blood watched Brightwater slide her hand down his stomach and grab hold of him, and he thought, who cares? How do we know that you are not the one who cursed White Hand? Crooked Eye looked at Sharp Elbow and wished he would leave too. The man made him nervous, and nerves were not good for him when he wanted to ply his trade. Nerves made him freeze up and stopped his mouth. Crooked Eye returned his gaze to White Hand, hiding his disgust as the sick man spat a huge mass past him and out the mouth of the cave. I scarcely know White Hand and have no grudge against him, so why would I set a wasting spirit on him? Sharp Elbow took a moment to think. My brother has many enemies. Maybe one of them paid you well to bring the spirit. This time Crooked Eye did not have to think. Did I not say I had no control over spirits? And even if I had, cursed the man, I would have only to chase the spirit, and White Hand would get well. You would let me go, never knowing that I was the one who brought the corpse maker in the first place. Crooked Eye fought to keep from letting himself feel clever. He had been in exchanges like this one before, and knew how quickly things could turn. He needed to keep himself sharp and ready. You two speak as if I am not here or asleep, White Hand said, amused and angry at the same time. Since I may have an interest in your words, let me ask you a question, Crooked Eye. If you did not send this spirit, who did? Crooked Eye ground his teeth. He still could not remember much of White Hand, but he knew better than to leave his question completely without answer. This corpse maker is a strong one, and it will not allow me to see who sent it. The two brothers just looked at him, and Crooked Eye knew they expected more. So, grudgingly, he gave it to them. There is a way to find out, but it will take time. The unseen ones, good and bad, know one another and move together like swirling water. If I can get another one to speak to me, it may tell me who sent the wasting spirit and why. Sharp Elbow's eyes were full of attention and fascination. How will you get a spirit to come to you? Through offering and sacrifice. Crooked Eye choked out the words because he had no choice. He often had to think of clever ways to stall people who came to him so he could have time to think. But such a tactic would not work here. These were bad men. To put them off in another way was too risky. This way he would have his time to think, between screams. White Hand's eyes narrowed in memory. I have seen many petition the unseen ones in many ways. Which will you choose? The medicine man said, Before I decide, I must fast and pray. In this way the answer comes. It may also help if you tell me if you have had any dreams after you became ill. Crooked Eye watched White Hand's eyes grow wide and knew his arrow had struck the mark. He knew that illness and confinement always seemed to bring dreams, so his shot was not totally blind, but he still felt fortunate. Maybe the dreams could tell him something, anything about the man. I will tell you my dreams. I wish to understand them anyway, the sick man said. Crooked Eye looked at Sharp Elbow and then returned his eyes to White Hand. The man on the hides understood. Leave us, my brother. I do not wish you to be poisoned by my night visions. Sharp Elbow left immediately. He did not want to hear the things that shook his brother in his sleep. He did not wish the dreams to come to him and make him ill. 2 gone and 1 more to go, Crooked Eye thought, and then he tried desperately to keep his mind clear of the things he would soon have to endure to survive. Tends to Jump tried to keep his eyes on the woman's face as she spoke, but it wasn't easy. She was dressed modestly, like most women tended to, but all the modesty in the world could not conceal what Nappy had given her. My husband is missing, Snowbird said, in clear agitation. He has been gone most of the day. He never leaves home for that long. If I had you to return home to, neither would I, Tends to Jump said to himself. In truth, he had 5 wives, all of whom were considered desirable, but they were already his, and Snowbird was not, and that, of course, made her even more attractive to him. I want to look for him at the place where he likes to bathe, Snowbird continued. and I saw signs of a fight and a spot of blood. Something bad has happened to him. Maybe he can be found before—" She let her words stop, but her thoughts wouldn't. She knew there was little hope she would ever see Crooked Eye again. She looked pleadingly at the chieftain anyway. She refused to let herself grieve until she knew for sure. "This is bad," Tensajump said. "I will get a party of men together, and you will show them the spot with the blood. If Crooked Eye has been taken by enemies, perhaps there will still be time to save him." Tensajump tried to sound convincing in spite of what he knew, which was that those who were captured were usually killed, or worse than killed. He put a hand around Snowbird's shoulder in a way that, even in her worried state, she found to be overfamiliar. "You go now and wait for the men to get prepared." He ushered her toward her lodge, and then stood and watched her go, admiring the grace with which she moved. How that one-eyed trickster ever got to bed such a woman, let alone take her to wife, Tensajump had not a clue. It was true that Crooked Eye made a good living as their most respected shaman, but other men were just as wealthy. He was sure the man's wealth and position helped him gain Snowbird. Since he had become chief, Tensajump had gained 4 more wives himself. He had taken one of his wives merely because she was the sister of another and was made widow by the crow. But 3 of his wives, young and supple, were bought by his huge horse herd and the fact that he was a leader. As he walked toward One Knee, it never occurred to him that a woman might give herself to a man for other reasons. Maybe Crooked Eye really does have power and bewitched her, Tensajump said to himself before closing the subject in his mind. Crooked Eye is missing. We must get a search party together immediately, the chief said to One Knee. I want you to go. Get your weapons and your horse ready quietly. I do not want the whole camp in an uproar over this. Leave as soon as you can. Walk your horse by the stream and wait for the others. One Knee nodded excitedly. Tensajump knew he would not beg off such an important venture. The chief approached 5 other able-bodied men in the same way. Hopefully, they would all be discreet and leave camp at different times. He looked at the sun and guessed that they had less than half a day's light left to track by. I wish to go look for Crooked Eye as well. Tensajump whirled around and looked at the owner of the voice. As a matter of course, he looked at the young man's chest. I overheard you talking to Gray Eyes, and have already prepared myself. I need only your permission to join the hunt. The chief sighed. This one was a little young, but if he wanted to go risk his neck, so be it. Go then, just keep your mouth shut about it. Tensajump watched the tall, thin one nod, and then start walking immediately for the picketed horses. He started to have an uneasy feeling about the whole thing as he walked over to where Snowbird was standing. He nodded to her, and the 2 of them headed out of camp. After the chief had gathered the little band together, Snowbird led them to the part of the stream that grew wide. There was a great rock close to the bank that created a large eddy. A sizable yellow-throated trout was in Crooked Eye's place. It spooked immediately upon their approach, splashing the calm spot on its way downstream. Here, Snowbird said, pointing to a gravelly spot away from the stream. One Knee carefully avoided the human scat that had not yet hardened and studied the rocks. The signs were clear, but he spoke anyway, probably out of habit. He was one of their best trackers. A man was tackled here by another after squatting. The man who tackled him was heavy and landed on the squatter. Right there is a deep track where he sprung off one foot. It was a simple ambush. They knew their prey's habits and waited for him there. One Knee pointed to where the wood rose up and grew thick, then gestured at the water. The squatter did not use his sense and preferred to look at the stream instead of the woods, so he was hit from behind. He pointed to the dried blood that lay on a couple of stones. The fall may have broken the squatter's nose. Here are also 2 other sets of tracks. Tends to Jump grew impatient. You must start the search now. You are 7 and they are 3. You have the advantage if you can track them and catch them afield. If they make it back home with Crooked Eye, it will be too late. Go now. One Knee will lead you. Waste no more time. They all nodded and began to walk their horses behind One Knee as he led them into the wood. Maybe if the trail took them into more open country and was a clear one, they could ride their mounts, but for now the beasts were a nuisance. The assailants were on foot and would be slowed by the captive they had taken. If they could ride, they might be able to overtake them, but they still had half a day's head start. Tends to Jump walked with Snowbird back to camp. He looked at her. If the men did fail, at least something good might come of their failure. Walks in Blood felt excitement as he and the others followed behind One Knee. He had never really expected Tends to Jump to allow him to go. He had been disturbed when he heard about Crooked Eye's capture. Walks in Blood had an affection for the medicine man. Crooked Eye was one of the only grown men that seemed to like him and listened when he spoke. Walks in Blood wanted to help try and find him, knowing that it was better to do something than to do nothing and worry. But besides wanting to help find him, he wanted to go for other reasons. He was young, and he had rarely been afield. This was a chance to learn something, maybe to gain skills he would need later. If the mission turned into a raid, he might even be able to steal a horse or 2 that he could give Ravensbeak for Brightwater. He didn't really even think about the fact that he had joined his first war party until Gray Eyes started talking. It will not matter if they are 3 and we are 7 if they get wind of us and have guns. They could kill 3 of us before we knew it in an ambush. Then it would be 3 against 4. The others tried to ignore Gray Eyes in hopes he would close his mouth. Not only was it bad medicine to say such things when going to war, but it was undoubted that he would run over tired ground with his words. Those with such a gloomy outlook would not be disappointed. If they are the Snake people, Crow, or one of the other tribes that deal with the Napequan directly, you can be sure they will have at least one among them who can strike us with the invisible lightning. Smokesteep said, Gray Eyes, why not give your mouth a rest and still your tongue? How are your words helpful? I cannot keep quiet when there is something I do not understand, and I do not understand why Tends to Jump does not encourage trade with the Napequan. You yourself carry one of Napequan's good knives that you took off a dead Shoshone. Smokesteep had an unkind waking dream involving that knife and Gray Eyes, and then sighed. You sit in council with the rest of us. You know why the trade is said to be a bad thing. We cannot make the fire dust and the things that the guns spit. If our people start to use guns, they will forget how to use their own weapons, the ones we can cut and make ourselves. Then, if Napequan decides to no longer trade his guns and fire dust with us, what will we do? What if the Napequan really are tricksters sent by Nappy himself? What if the Pale Ones decide they are not our friends? And what if they decide to just get the hides we trade them for themselves and shoot and trap on our lands? Do not many already do so, despite the fact that we often take their hair from them? There is a certain truth in your words, Gray Eyes conceded. But enemy tribes do not think as we do. They already have guns, and how many of us have fallen before them? Even other bands of our own people have gone to Napequan's big lodges and gotten guns, often for only a few buffalo robes. We have to get guns or we will one day cease to be. Our enemies will wipe us away. The big measles has already dwindled our numbers. One Knee had heard enough. You two keep quiet. We are not at council. Just because the enemy I track is far from us does not mean there are not other ones who are closer. Do you two really want to die because you felt the need to have an old argument in the wood, and our good friends the Crows suddenly feel the need to enter your discussion? The war party moved silently after that, and Walks in Blood, for one, was sorry. He found their talk interesting. He had never seen Napaquan, and was curious about them. Were they like his people? Were they really able to do magic? And did they have things none of them had ever seen? What did their women look like? Walks in Blood had many such questions, but he would have to keep them for another time. They had been traveling slowly, leading their horses through heavy brush, but the trail was fresh and easy to follow. Now the land grew sparse and dry, and One Knee sent everyone in different directions using the sign language. Walks in Blood had to look for signs of the enemy's passing, so he forced himself to keep his mind still. He wanted to do well on this, his first real expedition of this nature. Before long, Leaping Calf whistled, and everyone moved toward him. He pointed at a large pile of dung filled with plant matter. The scat was not fresh, and One Knee looked at Walks in Blood before breaking the silence. The beast is long gone, and this is not a hunting party. Next time you find a big pile of dry animal dung, Leaping Calf, step in it on your way to look for signs of men. The little man took the scolding well. He just shrugged and turned up a hand. I thought it of interest, Leaping Calf said. The beast is a large one. Then he turned around and went about with his head bent to the ground. The others likewise continued their search, and before long the trail was picked up and followed once more. It headed about straight to the north, and soon the lay of the land told them that their quarry could only be traveling in that direction. The war party mounted and rode swiftly down the middle of a high-banked gorge. Walks in Blood felt uneasy because a better spot for an ambush could not be found, but it also felt good to be off his feet. He stroked his pony's neck and whispered softly in its ear. The pony was new to him, given to him by Wolf's Tail. Wolf's Tail was a rich man and gave him the animal, telling him, "Take this horse, young man, and ride through camp, telling all that Wolf's Tail has a son." Walks in Blood was grateful the man didn't have another daughter. He had needed a new mount badly. Now he had two horses, an old one and a young one. With a little luck, after this trip he might have even more horses. The sun began to set, and One Knee had to look for a place to make camp and water the horses. He sent Walks in Blood, Gray Eyes, and Smokes Deep out on foot to scout for water. They would need to save the water in their skins in case fresh drink could not be found. One Knee waited with the remaining members of his party at the end of the gorge. The land had risen finally, but they had spent a good deal of time on horseback, and One Knee was sure that they had gained much ground on the ones who had taken their shaman. Blinding light rent the darkness that Crooked Eyes sat in. 3 bears walked in and let go of one end of his burden. Heated rocks fell out of that end of the hide that carried them, and they toppled on some cold ones. Then he went back outside, grabbed the buffalo paunch bucket of water that lay by the entryway, and walked into the stifling enclosure again. He squinted toward one side of the lodge and said, "Having fun yet, shaman?" Then he poured some cool water on the hot stones and watched more steam billow up before leaving the sweat lodge. Crooked Eye wasn't sure if a person could be steamed to death, but Three Bears was doing his best to find out. The squat man kept coming with rocks and water far more often than was customary or needed. The medicine man sat on a flat rock in near total darkness, naked and drenched, hungry and trying to breathe. And as always, his mind was running at full speed. He thought maybe he had made a mistake by scaring Three Bears with Wood Duck's tail. It may have shut his mouth at the time, but Three Bears' fear wasn't enough to keep the man from torturing him with this wretched steam. And maybe Three Bears opened his mouth again when he was alone with White Hand and Sharp Elbow, and continued to deride his abilities as a healer, undermining his chances for survival in the process. Maybe the fear and doubt he had made Three Bears feel had only managed to make the man hate him even more. Crooked Eye had told the two brothers that he needed a sweat lodge built in order to pray and purify himself. He had explained that it would save time if he sought out the sacrifice he would have to perform and purified himself for the ritual at the same time. Crooked Eye really thought that the building of a sweat lodge would give him more time to think his way out of their clutches. But Sharp Elbow had immediately said, "We have already built one for White Hand, thinking it might help chase his illness. I will get some men to raise it for you." Crooked Eye's heart had sunk in disappointment. So here he was, naked and being suffocated by Three Bears. And this wasn't even a sacrifice he had to make. It was only a way to make oneself ready for that torture. Crooked Eye had tried to think of a plan, but how could he think when it was all he could do to breathe? And the course of his thoughts was always being diverted by images of men missing their fingers, men with strips of skin absent from their bodies, and men with horrible scars on their chests and backs. How could a man think under such pressure? And how could one make such an evil choice? Should I whack off a couple of my fingers, or should I skin myself like a rabbit? Not only might it come down to that, if he didn't think of something convincing, but he might have to cut off one of his fingers and still end up being killed for not saving White Hand, or at least thinking up a good lie. And after all, horrible pain and fear aren't too good for a man's mind, now are they? Crooked Eye fought to clear his thoughts and still the chiding voice in his head. He had spoken to old men who said that a man who thinks too hard will never come up with any good ideas. They said that sometimes the answer has to come from nothing, that a man's mind can block those important notions like a windbreak. But Crooked Eye had relied on his savvy and intelligence all his life. He had used his mental quickness to earn a living and to get himself out of trouble, as well as marry a good woman. He could not get his mind to stop bubbling like a cookpot. And at the back of his thoughts was something else, something that he feared as much as torture. He was a fraud and he knew it. He used his smarts to think up answers for troubled people, all the while pretending it was the spirits that supplied the answers. The people felt better and were grateful, and they sought to express their gratitude for services rendered. And the spirits didn't need the hides and horses, the tools and fresh game. Now did they? But he did. And he was not a man like Three Bears. Crooked Eye believed in the unseen ones. The thing that gnawed at the fringes of his mind was this. What if by pretending to call a spirit for White Hand, he actually did call one? And what if it was one he had angered for many winters by being a cheat and a liar in its name? A tribe needs a medicine man, he told himself, as the sweat ran out of him. The people needed him and were better off with him than without him. He filled an empty place in them and let them be happy and live their lives. Why would the spirits be angry with him for helping people? An image from his old nightmare floated through his mind. He saw Scorpion Foot saying, "Do you know what it means, boy, to see what I see? Crooked Eye felt a rush of fear chill him in the stifling clouds of steam, his mind and body already made more responsive to dark things by hunger and exposure to torturous heat. In his heart, he knew that the world of the spirits was real. He had known Scorpionfoot. He had felt the chill air that surrounded the man, like the odor of a bear. He had even felt it once when Scorpionfoot was not there. The medicine man forced the horrible sight from his mind with great effort, but another apparition took its place, this one also covered in blood and dead but striding with an easy gait and smiling a sickening smile. And it knew him. By the sun, it knew him and greeted him like an old friend. As the naked man shook in the steam and darkness, he knew he had seen too much, too many unexplainable things not to believe. Just because he had never seen a spirit didn't mean they weren't there. Yes, he had never seen a spirit, and he didn't want to see one. He had to think of something soon. Three Bears poked his gleeful head in the steam once again. Ready for some more, Crooked Eye? Gray Eyes had found water west of the end of the gorge. Night had come, and One Knee hoped their war party wasn't trampling on signs of their quarry as they headed for the woodland stream. The leader of the little band had reasoned out that since their enemies were on foot, they wouldn't be heading for the great mountains that lay to the west. The mountains looked close enough to throw a stone at, but were, in fact, very far away. The enemy would need horses for such a journey. Of course, One Knee knew that the men they followed could be meeting up with a larger band who were holding extra horses, but he chose to avoid such thoughts. Walks and Blood rode behind Sings Loud as the men moved single file behind Gray Eyes. He had felt his heart sink a little when One Knee had declared that they would have to give up the chase for the night and build a war lodge. It was not only that constructing a lodge was hard work, but also that Walks and Blood thought that Crooked Eye was close. It was just a feeling he had, but it was a strong feeling. And what if the enemy kept moving through the night? After all, they knew where they were going, and left the 7 of them far behind. But One Knee had said it was better to wait until first light than miss the trail and lose their prey for good. Gray Eyes led them to a stream that flowed just inside a wall of timber. The wood was thick with animal sound, but no one would be hunting for fresh game that night. Horses and men drank, and then a likely spot was found in a little hollow. Everyone set to work, felling straight trees about as big around as a man's leg, as well as larger ones that would form the base of the lodge. Since Walks and Blood was inexperienced, he was given the task of stripping the smaller trees of their branches. As he did this, he was told he should pile up the heavier boughs, tie them together, and drag them to the lodge site. Walks and Blood listened to the ringing sound of hatchets on trees and shook his head. Maybe it would be better to just sleep in the open on these boughs covered with blankets. The racket they were making could probably be heard by Crooked Eye's kidnappers. Now, instead of maybe resting for the night, as they were about to, the enemy would be sure to keep moving. The young man sighed. Oh well, this was his first war party. He would leave the decision-making to the old men. Before long, the war lodge was finished. It had a couple of layers of heavier logs around its base, a conical structure of lodge poles tied together where they met at the top, and it was covered by boughs and big pieces of bark. The 7 men sat inside in a circle. All were tired from their construction work, and ate the dried meat from their packs in silence. But after the meal, Smoke Steep brought out his pipe, filled it with tobacco, and, as its will, the smoke loosened the men's tongues. "This pipe," Smoke Steep said as he handed it to Rides Low, "is not only useful in this capacity," he exhaled a huge cloud, "but it is also my war medicine. It has been with me through many conflicts, and as you can see, so far so good." Smoke Steep patted his chest firmly. Sings Loud turned his head sideways and grabbed the big eagle feather that was tied in his hair. He held up the feather, dyed the sacred color, and said, "This was given me by my father. He told me I should wear it when going to war, now that his day was done. He told me about all the men he had killed, and his eyes grew wet. I do not know if he felt regret at those he had killed, or was going to miss killing even more." One he didn't like to hear such foolish talk, but the other men just laughed. Gray Eyes said, "If Iron Nose is going to feel regret over all the enemies he has killed, he is going to be one sad old man." Gray Eyes nodded at Sings Loud, who beamed at the acknowledgment the older man had given him. Gray Eyes lifted the brass button he wore as the pendant of a rawhide necklace. "This shiny little thing came off a trapper's coat. The trapper was a brave man. He still came at me with 3 arrows in him. Even with all that wood in him, he fought me with his knife, and nearly killed me. Such an enemy makes a man strong, and I wear the metal fastener to remind me that I killed such a one." Walk's blood shifted nervously where he sat. He didn't like where this discussion was going. He was the youngest there, and felt uneasy at his own inexperience. And men never talked about their war medicines unless they were purchasing some from an old warrior, or they were going to need that medicine soon. "I had a dream long ago that told me to draw the sharp moon on my shield in my own blood," Leaping Calf said. "The wolf in the dream told me the arrows of my enemies would smell the blood on my shield and be fooled into thinking my blood was already spilled. It has worked so far for arrows, but as for lead balls—" The man shrugged his doubt. Smoke Steep shot Leaping Calf a look. He didn't want to hear any more moaning about them not having guns. He watched Gray Eyes stir himself to speak and thought, "Please, not again," when the young one struck them all dumb. "I have no war medicine," Walks in Blood said. "I have never been to war and was not expecting to go so soon, so I have none. There was no time for me to get any." Walks in Blood looked at the other men in the low light of the willow fire. They were all staring at him with a look that Walks in Blood was all too familiar with. They were looking at him like he was a crazy man. He took the pipe from Leaping Calf and relit it with a branch from the fire for something to do to keep himself from running out of the lodge. "Why would you go to war unaided?" Sings Loud asked in astonishment. Walks in Blood took a moment to smoke before answering. "Crooked Eye is a friend. I did not think about it. I just decided to go. I was more afraid of losing Crooked Eye without trying to do something to help than being hurt or killed in battle. Doing nothing when you are needed would be a powerful thing to live with." One he didn't understand. "Were you not told to go like the rest of us?" He had thought it a little strange that Tends to Jump had chosen an untried boy like Walks in Blood, but the boy had acquitted himself well so far, so One had thought the chief had just made a good choice. "No, I was not chosen to go. You could say I invited myself to this party." The boy smiled in his shy way. The men grew quiet until they began to drop off to sleep one by one. Half of them thought that the boy had done a brave thing. The other half also thought him brave, and as mad as a hare walking on 2 legs. When they were all gathered and mounted the next morning, Rides Low surprised them all by speaking. I must return home. I had a dream last night that my wife and daughter were weeping bitterly. It is a warning I must heed." The man spoke intensely, and none doubted he had had the dream. Rideslow wasn't asking for the others' permission to go. He was merely informing them. He immediately kicked his horse and headed in a southeasterly direction. The other men just looked at each other in the dim light. As far as Walks in Blood knew, the first thing the man had said since starting the trip was to tell everyone he was leaving it. The remaining 6 men rode back toward the gorge in silence. When they got to the place where the trail left off from the night before, they quickly found out they may as well have kept riding in the dark. After finding 2 more tokens of human passage, the trail just died. No sign of man or beast could be found, even though they employed the strategy that had worked the day before. All the trackers returned to the place where Walks in Blood held their horses with puzzled looks on their faces. One Knee gave it some thought. He looked at the mountains in the west and the forest to the east. He looked at the open land to the north that sloped gradually away. "We will go on blindly for a time. 3 of us will go in front of the other 3 on foot. The middleman will head straight north, and 2 men will flank him. The footmen will be given a chance to ride. New walkers will be chosen to spell them. We have come too far to give up our chase just yet."